In the cold, echoing silence of the Sanctum Hereticus on Terra, the dust of millennia settles on shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten sins. Here truth and heresy are indistinguishable, buried together in the endless archives of the Ordo Hereticus. My name is Inquisitor Aristus, and for 2 centuries I have walked these halls, my mind a fortress against the lies of the mutant, the witch, and the traitor. I have held the burning hearts of saints and the blasphemous tomes of apostates. I have ordered the cleansing of worlds, my conscience clear, my duty absolute. I have seen the anatomy of damnation 1,000 times over: pride, ambition, rage, despair. It is a familiar, putrid map. But this file, it offers no such clarity. Dossier 9997-4 marked only chapter Lamenters, Extinctus, solved, a word of bureaucratic finality, a lie. Before me, resting on a field of worn black velvet, is the only physical evidence retrieved from the digested ruins of Coria. It is not a proud banner. It is not the power sword of a hero. It is a fragment, a single shattered piece of ceramite pauldron, no larger than my calloused hand. The yellow paint, the color of defiant hope, is cracked and scorched, scoured to the bone by bioacids and the vacuum of space. Yet the sigil, though fractured, endures. A simple heart pierced, from which issues a single drop of crimson blood, the symbol of the Lamenters. I have spent my life hunting the fall. I trace the rot, the precise moment a soul turns from the Emperor's light. But as I read these accounts compiled from fleeting signals, survivor testimonies, and the cold condemnations of my predecessors, I find no familiar path. The tragedy of the Lamenters is not a fall into chaos. It is not the comforting, simple story of noble warriors corrupted by the whispers of the arch-enemy. Theirs is not a tale of ambition curdling into treason or strength festering into arrogance. No, their tragedy, I fear, is something far more profane, far more terrifying to the structure of our Imperium. It is the story of a fall into compassion. It is the chronicle of a chapter damned not by its sins, but by its virtues. They are the ultimate embodiment of hope, a hope that this galaxy in its infinite grinding cruelty is designed to systematically identify, isolate, and annihilate. Holding this shard, this final testament of 100 centuries of suffering, I am forced to confront the questions that my Ordo deems heresy even to think. What is the meaning of loyalty when it is never ever rewarded? What is the purpose of fealty when every oath is met with suspicion, every victory punished, every desperate plea for aid answered with silence? What is the value of compassion, that most human, most dangerous of emotions in a galaxy that feeds only on slaughter and survives only through callousness? The Imperium of man is a colossus built upon a mountain of bones, its foundations mortared with the blood of sacrificed heroes. We are an empire of 100 million worlds demanding a tithe of suffering that beggars imagination. We burn cities to deny them to the foe. We execute billions to prevent the potential heresy of one. This is the grim calculus of our survival, the catechism we recite in the dark. We accept this. We must. And yet, even among the uncountable quadrillions fed to the pyre, the fate of the Lamenters stands apart. It is not a statistic. It is an accusation. It is a weeping wound on the soul of the Imperium, a festering reminder that survival may not be enough. They were born of the blood of Sanguinius, the great angel, the brightest and most noble of the Primarchs. His sons all carry his divine grace, and all carry his terrible curse, the red thirst that drives them to madness, the black rage that plunges them into an echo of their father's final agony. The Lamenters were born of that bloodline, but they were born of hubris, an attempt in the shadowed gene forges of Terra during the cursed 21st founding to improve the angel, to filter out the flaw. The Adeptus Terra, in its arrogance, believed it could excise the rage, the thirst. They failed. Oh, they failed, but not in the way they imagined. They did not remove the flaw. They merely changed its expression. They did not create warriors free of the curse. They created warriors who bore the entirety of Sanguinius's sorrow. They were cursed not with a bestial rage, but with a profound, crippling empathy. They were cursed with the ability to see beauty in this charnel house of a galaxy. They were damned with the capacity to feel the agony of every civilian they failed to save, to weep for the worlds they were forced to purge. They were artists, poets, and musicians forced to be butchers. This file before me details their errors in judgment, their refusal to execute civilian populations, their decision to stand with a protector rather than a tithe master, their final impossible choice. But the verdict was written the moment their first gene seed was cultured. Their crime was not treason. Their crime was hope. Their heresy was the belief that the Imperium could be better than it is. This is not the record of their fall. This is the testament of the cursed. This is their lament. My gloved fingers turn the brittle, nano-etched vellum of the dossier. The script is precise, cold, high Gothic, the ink synthesized centuries before my birth. It begins, as all such imperial tragedies do, not with malice, but with pride. The 35th Millennium. The age of apostasy had torn the Imperium's soul apart, and though Vandira was dead, the scars remained. The High Lords of Terror, in their suffocating paranoid wisdom, demanded solutions. They demanded more chapters of Astartes, more blades to hold back the encroaching, endless night. But simple quantity, they argued, was not enough for their ambitions. They demanded perfection, and so was born the 21st Founding. Even now, 10,000 years later, the name is spoken only in hushed whispers in the deepest vaults of the Administratum. It is filed under Damnatio Memoriae. We know it by its true name, the Cursed Founding. The entire project was steeped in a secrecy, born of utter terror and unprecedented hubris. The gene labs deep beneath the Imperial Palace became fortresses of paranoia. The Magos biologists and the janitors summoned to this task were the most brilliant, the most arrogant, the most willing to tamper with the Emperor's own divine work. They were not merely propagating gene seed, they sought to improve it, to stabilize, to enhance, to correct the sacred inheritance of the Primarchs. What monumental folly, what unspeakable arrogance. The dossier lists the previous attempts, the control groups, the failures that preceded the Lamenters. I have seen these names elsewhere scored through with the black ink of my Ordo, condemned and purged, the firehawks damned to burn for eternity in the fiery prison of the Hadex anomaly. The sons of Antaeus swollen into grotesque parodies of Astartes. The black dragons, their bodies twisting their bones, sprouting into hideous blades, a living mockery of the sacred form. Every attempt to meddle with the Holy Code had resulted in damnation, grotesque mutation, or simple catastrophic failure. The halls of the gene forges echoed with the screams of failed aspirants and the constant purifying crackle of the flamer. The fear of repeating these nightmares was palpable, yet they persisted. The High Lords demanded it. The Adeptus Mechanicus, eager to prove their mastery over flesh, promised it. They truly believed they could master the stuff of gods. And then their gaze fell upon the most cherished, most tragic of all bloodlines, the scions of Sanguinius, the blood of the angel. It was the purest and yet the most profoundly tainted. For every act of nobility, for every feat of sublime, transcendent courage, the twin shadows of the red thirst and the black rage loomed. It was the flaw. It was the great secret sorrow of the blood angels and all their successors, a spiritual cancer that consumed their best and brightest, turning peerless heroes into howling, blood-mad beasts, forever trapped in the final moments of their father's agony. The Magos biologists assigned to this blasphemous task, their names are of course redacted, struck from all records by plasma scorers, proposed the impossible. They claimed they had isolated the gene sequences responsible for the flaw. They proclaimed they could filter it. They would create a chapter of Sanguinius's sons free from the shadow, retaining all the grace, all the artistry, and all the martial perfection of their Primarch, with none of the madness. They envisioned a legion of golden-haired demigods, perfect in mind and body, the ultimate expression of the angel's legacy. A weapon finally stabilized. The dossier includes excerpts from their progress logs. The arrogance drips from every quantified word. Sequence isolated. Aberration neutralized. Zeta level filtering complete. Prognosis stable. And so the Lamenters were born. In the beginning, they were a triumph. The gene seed was stable. The implantation success rate was near perfect, an unheard of anomaly. The first aspirants were flawless. They were everything the genitors had hoped for. They were strong, they were fast, they were noble. But most importantly, they were stable. There was no sign of the red thirst. The black rage, that psychic echo of Sanguinius's death at the hands of the arch-traitor, was utterly absent. The High Lords were ecstatic. The Mechanicus savored its victory. A new chapter, pure and untainted, was presented to the Imperium, their armor painted a brilliant, hopeful yellow. They were the perfect sons, the cure to the angels' long lament. The genitors in their clinical blindness had recorded their success. They truly believed they had excised the flaw. They were wrong. They were so devastatingly, horrifyingly wrong. They had not removed the curse. They had merely changed its expression. They had taken the raw, explosive psychic fury of the black rage and the red thirst, and they had not nullified it. They had inverted it. They had forged it into a different kind of anchor, a spiritual lodestone that did not draw rage, but drew sorrow. Instead of a consuming thirst for blood, they had cursed them with a boundless capacity for grief. Instead of a battle madness that forgot the present, they had cursed them with a profound, crippling empathy that felt the pain of everything around them. They had not created warriors free of the flaw. They had created a chapter of poets and artists forced to be butchers. They had created perfect warriors destined to feel every cut, every death, every loss, not just on their own skin, but on the very soul of the Imperium itself. The first entry in the file after the triumphant celebrations of their creation is a simple cold notation from the Lord Commander of the Imperium: let them prove their worth. They would. By the throne, they would prove it. They would prove it until there was nothing left. The gene logs cease their triumphant declarations, and the file shifts to picked captures and after-action reports. This is where the true nature of the flaw, the one the Magos biologists so proudly claimed to have erased, began to manifest. It was not in their bodies, but in their souls. The archives of other chapters, the Ultramarines, the Imperial Fists, are filled with treatises on strategy, bolter drills, and the glorious calculus of war. Their fortress monasteries are brutalist monuments to martial prowess, their halls lined with the skulls of conquered foes and the banners of triumphant campaigns. They are fortresses pure and simple, designed to forge weapons. The Lamenters' home, their magnificent wandering fleet-based monastery, the Mater Lacrimarum, the Mother of Tears, was different. My dossier contains Vox logs from liaison officers and Mechanicus adepts who were granted access. Their reports are laced with confusion, and in some cases outright discomfort. The primary training holds the Sallows were immaculate, the rites of bolter practice and Chainsword catechisms observed with a chilling angelic precision. But the rest of the vessel was not a barracks. It was a reliquary. The Lamenters were not just warriors. They were artisans. In the long voids between crusades, their hands, which could crush the throat of an orc warlord, were put to work carving marble, applying pigment to canvas, and composing verse. The bulkheads of their strike cruisers were not bare grey steel. They were covered in breathtaking frescoes depicting not glorious victories, but mournful landscapes of worlds now lost. They crafted intricate sculptures from the wreckage of their own ravaged tanks. Their chaplains did not just roar litanies of hate. They sang haunting polyphonic laments for the fallen, their augmented voices echoing with a beauty that terrified the ecclesiarchal observers. This was not the quiet, disciplined artistry of Vulcan's sons, the crafting of a perfect weapon. This was emotional. They cherished the very concept of beauty. They revered life in all its fragile, transient forms. And this, the dossier concludes, is what made them such terrifying, tragic warriors. When a Standard Astartes chapter purges a world, they do so from a sense of cold duty, or perhaps a righteous, uncomplicated hatred. They are the Emperor's wrath, swift and absolute. When the Lamenters went to war, they fought with a desperate, sorrowful fury. They did not hate the alien simply because it was alien. They hated it for its desire to destroy. They fought to protect, not just to conquer. They saw the beauty in a hive city's soaring spires, in the terrified, upturned face of a child, in the simple, mundane existence of the imperial citizen. And when the archenemy or the Xenos sought to burn it, their rage was not the black rage. It was the focused, burning, cold rage of a protector who sees what he loves being violated. This then was the whole, the flaw, the true expression of their curse. They were built to feel. I turn the page. The file references their third ever campaign. The pacification of Agrosh Prime, a forge world that had fallen silent, presumed lost to an Orc Wagsh. The Lamenters were sent as the vanguard. The initial reports are standard: a flawless orbital insertion, surgical strikes against key Orc infrastructure. The Lamenters moved like golden-clad ghosts, their tactics precise, their discipline absolute. They retook the primary manufactorum hive in 72 hours. The dossier contains a concurrent report from a nearby system where the Mortifactors chapter engaged in a similar action simply declared exterminatus upon signs of entrenched Orc resistance, calculating civilian losses as acceptable. The Lamenters did not. They fought street by street, bulkhead by bulkhead, taking casualties to preserve the very infrastructure and the population they were sent to liberate. Then comes the first official inquisitorial censure. It is a pict capture, grainy and monochrome, taken by an Ordo Xenos observer accompanying the campaign. The scene is a rubble-choked plaza. The battle has moved on. The air is thick with corpse smoke and pulverized ferrocrete. In the center of the frame stands a single Lamenter, a giant in battered yellow. He is kneeling. Before him, half buried under a collapsed hab block, is a child, a girl no older than 5. Her body is broken. She is dying. The pict capture shows the Astartes brother Chiron designation 749 Delta looking at the child. Then, in a shocking, unpardonable breach of tactical protocol, the seals on his helmet hiss open. He removes it, letting it fall to the dust. His face is revealed scarred, noble, his features contorted not in rage, but in a profound, agonizing sorrow. His vox-distorted growl is gone. The observer's audio log captures his real voice, soft, resonant, as he leans close to the dying child. He is not interrogating her. He is not administering the Emperor's peace with a bolt shell. He is comforting her. He is humming a low, sad tune, a chapter lament, and he stays there, a 2.5-meter statue of grief, until the last spark of life fades from her eyes. The observer's attached note is chilling in its simplicity. Subject brother Chiron Lamenters. Action engaged in non-tactical, emotionally driven interaction with non-viable civilian asset. Duration: 17 minutes. Assessment: potential psychological deviation, emotional contamination. Recommend chapter-wide purity evaluation. The local populace who survived called them the Angeli Dolorosa, the sorrowful angels. They loved them. And in the eyes of the Imperium, that was the most dangerous sign of all. Fear is the currency of control. Compassion is the seed of The annotation regarding Brother Chiron's emotional contamination was only the beginning. It was a single note from a single Ordo Xenos observer. But here in my archive, it is appended to the first report of a truly defining catastrophe: the Corellia disaster. Corellia was a verdant agri-world on the eastern fringe, an unremarkable but vital planet supplying sustenance to 3 industrial systems. Its distress signal was brief, clipped by static and an inhuman shriek. A Drukhari raid. Fast. Vicious. The Lamenters' fleet on patrol in a nearby nebula was the only Astartes force within interception range. Their mission profile recovered from the logs of the Mater Lacrimarum shows a flawless plan. Chapter Master Malakim Foros, a strategist as gifted as he was a poet, laid out a textbook hammer and anvil strike. Their fast attack elements would conduct a hard burn into the flimsy Drukhari fleet, while First Company Terminators would teleport directly into the central slave pits, severing the head of the raid. The plan by all cogitator simulations would have saved at least 80% of the population. They translated from the warp poised for the strike, and the universe said no. There was no forecasted warp storm, no local astropathic disturbance, but the logs of the Mater Lacrimarum become a scramble of panic. Unidentified empiric distortion. Geller field critical fluctuation. Navigator contact lost. A sudden localized spasm of real space. An unheralded warp tide that slammed into them and receded in an instant. The entire Lamenters fleet, from their mighty flagship to their nimblest escorts, was thrown like dice from a gambler's cup. They were not lost to the warp. They were not destroyed. They were simply displaced. Hurled dozens of light years off course, scattered their warp engines screaming in the chaotic wake. It took them 3 standard Terran weeks to regather their battered fleet to fight the empiric countercurrents and to return to Corellia. 3 weeks. When they arrived, the skies were clear. The Drukhari were long gone, and the planet was silent. The picked reports included in this dossier are thorough. Foros ordered his chapter to make planetfall not to fight, but to bear witness, to record. They walked through cities populated only by the dead, plazas decorated with sculptures of flayed skin, piles of corpses stacked 5 stories high against hab blocks, millions upon millions methodically slaughtered. They were too late. Their plan was perfect, their intent was pure, but fate itself had intervened, holding them back, so they could arrive only as mourners for a dead world. Sector Command censured them for unacceptable tardiness. If Corellia was a tragedy of fate, the Toronis War Games were an act of personal humiliation. To quell the rumors of their incompetence, following Corellia High Command ordered the Lamenters to participate in a massive joint training exercise in Segmentum Ultima. They were to stand alongside the Sons of Guilliman, the Ultramarines chapter, and a detachment of the Silver Skulls. It was a show of imperial strength designed to impress wavering planetary governors. The Lamenters performed perfectly. Their discipline was faultless. Their marksmanship outclassed the other chapters in live fire drills. Their bright yellow armor was a vision of hope and efficiency. The Ultramarine officers, initially cold, were beginning to show grudging respect. The exercise's climax was a simulated Thunderhawk assault on a cleared granite fortress. The Lamenters' gunship, the Angel's Mercy, was on a strafing run, its Lascannons firing on designated hardpoints. I have reviewed the cogitator log from its cockpit. All systems green. Target lock confirmed. All specs clear. Firing solution stable. And then a single line burning red, Error 771 Malignant Cogitator. The gunship did not shudder. It did not lose power. Instead, one of its Lascannon turrets, guided by a machine spirit no tech marine could later explain, traversed 3 degrees to starboard entirely on its own. It fired. The beam of annihilating energy intended for a stone bunker instead lanced across the void-shielded bridge of the observing ultramarine strike cruiser, the Courage of Konor, in high orbit. The void shields flared and collapsed. The beam cut through the adamantium, vaporizing the bridge in a silent explosion. 4 ultramarines Astartes were killed instantly, including a veteran honor guard captain. The ship was crippled. The war games stopped. No apology was sufficient. The Ultramarines did not accuse them of treason. They delivered a far more damning verdict: unreliable. The Thunderhawk was impounded and disassembled by the Adeptus Mechanicus. After months of analysis, their final report was a single, terrifying sentence, no technical fault found. Machine spirit, uncooperative. A nonsensical and horrifying diagnosis. The Lamenters' reputation was ruined. They were not just sentimental, they were unlucky. They were a danger to their own allies. and it is here in this file that I see the seal of my order appear for the first time, the inquisitorial rosette of the Ordo Hereticus. To an inquisitor there is no such thing as coincidence. There is only enemy action or divine will. A chapter racing to a planet's rescue is thwarted by a rogue warp storm, tragic but possible. A chapter firing on an ally is betrayed by an inexplicable machine fault, suspicious but possible. But both events happening to the same chapter in such a short span? No, the logic of the Inquisition is unyielding. This was not misfortune. This was a signature. It was a shadow. The universe itself was rejecting them. Such a concentration of ill fortune was not random. It was a symptom of an underlying taint. The warp was clinging to them. It was bending probability around them. It was using their compassion and their bad luck as a conduit for chaos. The file on Chapter Lamenters, previously a minor chapter monitoring brief, was officially transferred to the Ordo Hereticus under the designation Potentialis Maleficarum. The whispers had begun. They were no longer considered flawed. They were considered cursed. The brand Potentialis Maleficarum was not a death sentence. Not yet. It was something slower, more insidious. It was a poison dripped into the well of their reputation. It was a bureaucratic curse that ensured every hand, every institution of the Imperium would turn against them. The file now shifts from after-action reports to logistical manifests and inter-chapter communiques. They are a litany of delays. The Lamenters fleet still scarred from the Toronis incident, and low on fuel after the Corellia detour made for the Adeptus Mechanicus orbital station, Magos Prime 7. They broadcast the standard codes for rearmament and resupply. The station's reply is preserved in the archive. Cold, stilted. Request received. Stand by for processing. They stood by. For 9 days, Foros's subsequent messages grow more urgent. Their patrol mandate required them to be in the adjoining sector. Their machine spirits were howling for sacred oils. Their food stocks were low. The reply from the tech priests was unchanging. Processing. Irregularities in your chapter's logistical identifiers require sanctification. Irregularities. A bureaucratic knife in the back. There were no irregularities, but the quiet astropathic signal from my order, which I see cross-referenced here, had been clear to the station's Magos observe. Delay. Report. Do not engage. On the 10th day, a battered flotilla of Imperial Navy frigates mauled by Orc pirates limped into orbit. They were granted docking priority and were fully resupplied within 12 hours. The Lamenters, heroes of the Imperium, saviors of 100 worlds, were forced to watch and wait, their status lower than a common Navy shipmaster. Humiliated Malachim Foros gave the order to depart with what little they had. They would make for the nearest friendly system, even if it meant running on emergency power. They were forced to leave the system with depleted magazines and near-empty fuel bunkers. A chapter of Astartes turned into beggars by a clerk's memo. The isolation was now physical as well as spiritual. But the final nail was driven in not by a bureaucrat, but by a brother. The file cites a rendezvous at the Tenebris Watch Station, a joint chapter staging ground. The Lamenters had arrived to take on their patrol orders, their yellow armor looking worn and tarnished. As their delegation led by Chaplain Chiaroscuro entered the briefing hall, the assembled Astartes from other chapters, Imperial Fist's Black Templars, fell silent. One chaplain, a grizzled veteran of the Howling Griffins, a chapter known for its inflexible piety, stepped forward. He did not offer the traditional warrior's greeting. He did not clasp arms. He made the sign of the Aquila, but with his fingers pointed downward. The averting sign. The audio log captures his voice, a harsh grate of sanctified judgment. "We know what you are," the Griffin chaplain snarled, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "You carry the stench of misfortune. You are not the sorrowful angels. You are a walking hex. You are the weeping sore, the Lamenters." He spat the name like a curse. Lamenters. Those who cry, those who mourn, those who bring only grief. Chaplain Chiaroscuro's reply is not recorded, only his action. He simply turned his white and black death mask of a helmet betraying no emotion and led his delegation from the hall. The name stuck. When Foros heard this, the dossier states he ordered the chapter serfs to begin the work immediately. The old identifiers, the proud Angeli Dolorosa, were scoured from their hulls and banners. When the Mater Lacrimarum left Tenebris, it bore its new name emblazoned in stark, defiant Gothic script across its prow. They were the Lamenters. They accepted the insult. They took the curse and wore it as a mantle. They would bear their lament for all the Imperium to see. They were the shunned, the cursed, the pariahs, and they would endure. The dossier now makes a significant chronological leap. Decades, centuries of mistrust and isolation pass in a blur of minor campaigns and dutiful patrols. The Lamenters served always on the fringes, always in the sectors no one else wanted. They bled in the dark, far from the light of terror. Their small victories unrecorded, their many tragic losses expected. They became ghosts, a rumor of ill fortune. And then came the Maelstrom. That swirling vortex of insanity, a permanent scar of warp space bleeding into the material realm, second only to the eye of terror itself. It is a region of anarchy, piracy, and constant unending war. Patrolling this zone was considered a punishment detail. For the Lamenters, it was simply their duty. For nearly a century, they were the primary Astartes' presence defending the Maelstrom Zone, a handful of battered cruisers against an ocean of chaos. It is here that a new name enters the record, a name that would soon be spoken only alongside those of Abaddon and the greatest of traitors. But at the time, he was a hero. Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, Lord Protector of the Badab system, the Tyrant of Badab. My archives are overflowing with data on Huron. He was, by all accounts, a figure of terrible, blinding charisma. He was not a frothing madman. He was a genius, a warrior without peer, a strategist who had held the Maelstrom Zone together with little more than iron will and brilliant tactical acumen. He was proud, yes, arrogant, ambitious, but he cloaked it all in the mantle of duty. The picked captures of him from this era show him in his prime. Towering regal, his armor immaculate. When he spoke, he did not whisper of chaos or rail against the Emperor. He spoke of order. He spoke of efficiency. He spoke of the failure of the distant glacial bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra, so many thousands of light years away to understand the reality of the Maelstrom. Terra demands its tithes, he is quoted as saying in a broadcast to the regional governors. But where are Terra's fleets when the Red Corsairs descend? Where is the Administratum's aid when your manufactories burn? I am here. The Astral Claws are here. We are your shield. And here the Lamenters' tragedy finds its perfect catalyst. The dossier contains patrol logs from the Mater Lacrimarum reports filed by Malachim Foros himself, desperate pleas to Sector Command that the records show went unanswered. For decades, the Lamenters had watched the worlds they were sworn to protect suffer. They would fight off a massive orc raid on one planet, only to return and find the Administratum tithe ships demanding ruinous payments in grain and manpower, leaving the population to starve. They would repel a wave of Xeno's slavers, only to see the planetary governor executed by the Officio Munitorum for failing to meet recruitment quotas. To the Lamenters, whose very souls were attuned to suffering, this was an obscenity. It was a failure of the very Imperium they had sworn to serve. They were protecting these people from the alien, only to watch them be devoured by the callous, grinding gears of their own empire. Then Luft Huron made his proposal. The meeting is recorded. It took place not in a shadowed fortress, but in the glittering observation dome of the Astral Claws flagship. Huron, ever the statesman, had invited the chapter masters of the other Maelstrom wardens, the Lamenters, the Mantis warriors. He laid out his case with cold, impeccable logic. The Maelstrom was growing more violent. The tithes demanded by Terra were unsustainable. The people were suffering. The only solution, he argued, was autonomy. He did not speak of secession. He did not speak of rebellion. He used the words temporary self-reliance, consolidation of resources, the protectorate. He proposed that the Maelstrom Wardens seize control of the tithes. Not to steal them, he assured them, but to use them. To build fortifications, to raise armies, to create a stable defended bastion of imperial worlds strong enough to stand on their own until the wider Imperium could send proper aid. It was, he argued, the only logical, compassionate course of action. The Mantis warriors agreed out of pride and a desire for independence. The Lamenters, they agreed out of pity. I can almost hear the debate in Foros's council chamber. I can see the anguish. To defy an edict of the High Lords was unthinkable. But to continue to watch their people suffer and die under a system that was clearly, demonstrably failing them, that was the greater sin. They had been shunned by the Imperium. Their allies had turned from them. Their loyalty had earned them nothing but scorn and isolation. But here finally was a chance to do good, a chance to make their suffering and the suffering of those they protected mean something. Huron's argument found the precise, resonant frequency of their deepest flaw. He did not appeal to their ambition, for they had none. He did not appeal to their greed. He appealed to their empathy. He offered them the one thing they craved more than absolution, a chance to be the protectors they were always meant to be. The dossier records Malakim Foros's reply to Huron, a single fateful astropathic signal. We stand with you, for the people of the Maelstrom, for the true duty of the Emperor. The die was cast. The trap, baited with compassion, had sprung. The Lamenters, in an attempt to save lives, had just condemned themselves and unknowingly joined a war against the very Imperium they loved. The Lamenters' choice, born of a compassion that the Imperium had long since purged from its own heart, was not met with a request for clarification. It was not answered with a diplomatic envoy. The Imperium, in its monolithic paranoid certainty, does not debate. It condemns. The dossier contains the fragment, a hard-coded astropathic edict broadcast from the hallowed halls of the Senatorum Imperialis on Terra, overriding all other signals, burning itself into the cogitators of every imperial vessel in the segmentum. It was not a declaration of war, it was a writ of execution. Luft Huron, for his act of consolidation, was declared excommunicate traitoris, a traitor, a heretic, beyond all redemption, and with him all who had pledged him fealty, the Mantis warriors, the executioners, and the Lamenters. The shock on the bridge of the Mater Lacrimarum is recorded in the ship's log, a sudden cold spike in the emotional timbre readings. Malakim Foros, the poet warrior, could not comprehend it. He had not betrayed anyone. He had acted to save imperial citizens from a failing bureaucracy. He had upheld, he believed, the spirit of the Emperor's law, if not the letter. His vox logs from that day are a desperate, tragic litany of attempts to reason with the void. This is a misunderstanding he broadcast on all open imperial channels. We are the Lamenters. Our loyalty to the Emperor is absolute. We were protecting the Maelstrom from collapse. We demand to be heard. The response when it came was not from a diplomat. It was from the lead vessel of Battlefleet Solar, the first wave of the Loyalist Task Force. The reply is logged. One sentence: silence, traitor. Your plea is your confession. Your sentence is death. The Imperium had not sent inquisitors to investigate. It had not sent envoys to negotiate. It had sent chapters. It had sent the Red Scorpions, the Fire Angels, the Salamanders, and the Marines errant. It had sent brothers. And their orders were not to contain or to reason. Their orders were to purge. The first Battle of Garton's Drift was the Lamenters' first engagement. They were ambushed by a Fire Angel strike force while attempting to fall back to a defensible position. Foros gave the order to return fire, but his command was defensive. Disable their engines, do not destroy them. They are our brothers. His order was met with a full spread of torpedoes and lance strikes. The Fire Angels, utterly convinced of the Lamenters' treason, boarded the Sorrow's blade. And here the dossier's cold, detached script is stained with something new, something raw, frantic battlefield reports, vox recordings corrupted not by static but by screaming. For 10,000 years the Lamenters had been spared the deepest, darkest part of their sanguinian heritage. The gene tampering of the cursed founding, while cursing them with empathy, had successfully, until this moment, shackled the floor. The red thirst, the all-consuming mindless rage, had never manifested. Until now, trapped, betrayed by the Imperium they loved, shunned by the allies they respected, and now boarded, hunted, and being executed by their own kind, fighting Astartes in armor the color of righteous fire. The psychological pressure, the sheer agonizing injustice of it all, it shattered the dam. The gene code so arrogantly filtered by the Magos biologists ruptured. The logs of Brother Chaplain Chiaroscuro become a frantic, terrified scrawl. The blood is upon us, by the angel's final agony. The thirst, it is here, we are lost. The Lamenters defending the Sorrow's blade were no longer fighting with the sad, noble fury of a protector. They were not fighting with the disciplined skill of an Astartes. They were fighting with the snarling, blood-mad desperation of cornered animals. Their voxcasters, once filled with mournful battle hymns, now broadcast inhuman howls. When the fire angels breached the engine room, they were not met by noble warriors. They were met by yellow-armored things whose eyes glowed like burning coals, whose chainswords dripped not just with lubricant, but with gore, whose mouths were snarling as they tore their brothers apart, limb from limb. And to the Loyalists, this was the final, absolute proof. They did not see a tragic chapter succumbing to a long-dormant genetic curse broken by the trauma of fratricide. They saw monsters. They saw the chaotic corruption they had been sent to destroy. They saw the red thirst, the very mark of the floor, and they read it as the mark of Khorne. The Lamenters' desperate, agonized fight for survival became the ultimate evidence of their damnation. The prophecy of their cursed founding had in the cruelest way imaginable fulfilled itself. They were no longer just traitors. They were beasts. The outbreak of the red thirst was the final seal on their damnation. The dossier's tone shifts. The Lamenters are no longer referred to as secessionist or renegade. The Loyalist communiques from this point forward use a new, colder term, the Tainted. The Badab War raged for years, a grinding, brutal war of attrition. Luft-Huron the Tyrant proved to be a defensive genius, holding the combined might of the Loyalist task force at bay. But the Lamenters were not part of his grand strategy. They were isolated. They were being hunted. The reports in this file show them fighting a desperate three-front war against the Loyalists, who would kill them on sight, against the secessionists, who now distrusted them for their visible corruption, and against the gnawing, newly awakened thirst within their own blood. They were bleeding. They were exhausted. They were dying. And then the High Lords of Terror grew impatient. When the measured, honorable tactics of chapters like the Salamanders and Red Scorpions failed to break Huron's fortress, the High Lords unleashed their chain. They summoned the chapter that is not a chapter, the force that exists for one single, horrifying purpose. The file contains their designation spoken in hushed, fearful tones, even within my own Ordo the Minotaurs. Their history is a void. Their records are sealed at a level beyond even my clearance. They have no recorded home world. They have no lineage that they speak of. They just are. They are the blunt instrument of the High Lords, a fist of bronze and mindless fury kept in the dark, unleashed only when the Imperium's most sacred law is broken. Astartes must not fight Astartes. Unless, of course, the High Lords order it. The Minotaurs are the sanction. They are the specialists in fratricide. They are the ultimate expression of Terra's tyranny, a chapter of butchers whose sole reason for existence is to hunt and kill other space marines. There is no honor in them. There is no glory. There is only the mission. They are depicted in the accompanying Pict files as a wall of bronze-gold armor, their sigil the snarling bull's head. They do not engage in duels. They do not accept surrender. They do not speak. Their vox channels are filled only with a low, bestial growl, a constant menacing thrum. They are the antithesis of everything the Lamenters ever stood for. They are soulless, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Their orders, copies of which are included here, were simple: annihilate the Maelstrom Wardens. Begin with the weakest. Begin with the tainted. The Lamenters' fleet, now reduced to just a handful of capital ships and escort frigates, was limping through the Slin system, seeking refuge to make desperate repairs. Their fleet was scarred, pockmarked by weeks of running battles. The Mater Lacrimarum itself was leaking plasma from its port engine array. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting a moment's peace. The Minotaurs did not grant it. They translated from the warp, not in a precise tactical formation, but in a brutal, overwhelming wave. A fleet of bronze-clad battleships, pristine and fully armed, twice the size of the Lamenters' crippled flotilla. There was no hail, no demand for surrender. The void space of Slin erupted in a storm of lance fire and torpedoes. The Minotaurs' tactics were thuggish, crude, and utterly overwhelming. They did not maneuver. They simply advanced, all guns firing. They rammed the Lamenters' escort frigates, smashing them to scrap metal with their armored prows. They used point-blank broadsides to gut the strike cruiser Blade of Sorrow. It was not a battle. It was a culling. The Mater Lacrimarum, the beautiful flagship, the living museum of the Lamenters' grief and artistry, was cornered. It was alone. Then came the boarding torpedoes. Hundreds of them, like a swarm of iron locusts. They did not target vital systems like the bridge or the engine room. They just punched through the hull everywhere indiscriminately. The breaches were explosive. Alarms shrieked throughout the dying vessel, and into the sanctified halls poured the Minotaurs. The contrast, as recorded by the ship's internal security picts, is horrific. The Minotaurs were a solid, grinding wall of bronze. They moved in perfect, locked phalanxes, shields, forward axes, and bolt guns blazing. They were silent, save for the bull-like roar in their vox. They were not warriors. They were terminators in the purest, most ancient sense of the word. They were an extermination squad. Against them stood the last of the Lamenters. Their yellow armor was cracked, scorched, and stained. They were led by Malachim Phoros himself, his face bare, his expression one of ultimate agonized grief. He was not screaming in rage. He was weeping. He roared his last order: "Defend your art, defend your history, defend our soul." The Lamenters fought. Oh, by the throne how they fought! They fought with the tragic, beautiful grace of their bloodline. They were duelists, artists, poets, forced into a corner by soulless butchers. Their power swords flashed in intricate, deadly arcs. They sang their chapters' laments as they met the enemy, their voices clear and pure even as they died. The Minotaurs did not care. They smashed the elegant swordplay aside with their heavy shields. They broke the artists' limbs with crude, crushing blows from their power axes. They advanced step by step over the golden bodies of the fallen. They were not fighting. They were processing. They advanced into the great reliquary, the central hall, where the Lamenters kept their greatest works, the marble statues of their fallen heroes, the illuminated manuscripts of their epic poems, the vast frescoes depicting the worlds they had saved and the ones they had mourned. The Minotaurs showed no interest. They simply destroyed it. They used their heavy bolters to shatter 1,000-year-old statues. They put their power fists through priceless, irreplaceable canvases. They trampled the history, the soul of the Lamenters under their bronze-booted feet. The last pict log shows Malachim Phoros, his heart visibly broken, letting out a roar that was not of the red thirst, but of pure, unadulterated despair. He charged the Minotaur leader, a giant known only as the Bronze Bull, his twin power glaives a blur of golden light. The duel lasted less than 10 seconds. Phoros was an artist, a master of the blade. The Minotaur was a slab of meat. Phoros's first 2 strikes were parried with contemptuous, brutal force by the bull's heavy storm shield. The Minotaur didn't even attempt to riposte. He just waited. As Phoros lunged for a third desperate strike, the Minotaur simply stomped forward, smashing his shield into Phoros's chest, cracking his breastplate, and sending him flying. Before Phoros could even hit the deck, A follow-up blow from the bull's axe shattered his legs. It was over. The flagship was taken. The fleet was annihilated. The last of the Lamenters were beaten, their bodies broken, their legacy reduced to rubble. The final entry for this engagement is a cold, static-laced Vox transmission from the Minotaur fleet to the Loyalist command. Target the Tainted neutralized, all assets seized, awaiting further instruction. They had not just been defeated, they had been impounded. The final recorded signal from the Mater Lacrimarum was not a challenge. It was not the snarl of the Red Thirst, nor the curse of a traitor. It was an open broadcast encoded on the highest Astartes cipher sent across all channels. It was the voice of Malachim Foros, broken not by physical trauma, but by anguish. He was lying crushed beneath the boot of the Minotaur leader. "We surrender," the voice crackled faint but clear. "Chapter. Lamenters. Surrenders. To the judgment of the High Lords. We accept. Do not destroy our history. Spare the records." It was an almost unthinkable act. An Astartes chapter surrendering. To Luft-Huron and the remnants of the Astral Claws, it was the ultimate cowardice. When their own defeat was clear, they chose to run roaring oaths of vengeance, fleeing into the chaotic safety of the Maelstrom to become the chaos-damned Red Corsairs. But Foros had chosen a different path, a more painful one. He chose honor. He chose the truth. He knew he was no traitor, and he would not die like one. If he and his warriors were to be condemned, they would be condemned as loyal, wrongfully accused Astartes at the hands of the very Imperium they loved. It was his final act of defiance to force the Imperium to look at what it was doing. The chapter's survivors, numbering only a few hundred active warriors scattered across their shattered fleet, obeyed. From breached bulkheads, from dying ships, the Lamenters lowered their weapons. They fell silent before the brutality of the Minotaurs. They were brought to trial. It was no formal high-collared proceeding in the halls of terror. It was a drumhead court-martial on the flag deck of the Red Scorpion's flagship, the Blade of Purity. The Loyalist chapter masters, their armor still stained with the gore of fraternal war, stood as judge, jury, and executioner. Malachim Foros, kept cruelly alive by Minotaur apothecaries, for this specific purpose, was dragged before them in chains, his shattered yellow armor a mockery. The charges were read: treason, mutation, chaotic corruption. The testimony of the Red Scorpion's chaplains was damning. They had seen the Red Thirst unleashed. They had seen the savagery. "They are beasts," Lord High Commander Karab Cullen of the Red Scorpions pronounced, his voice cold steel. "They carry the rot of chaos like all of the cursed founding. The only sentence is death, annihilation of the chapter, obliteration of their gene seed." The Minotaurs standing guard at the rear growled in agreement. To them, this was just a bureaucratic delay before the execution. Foros offered no defense. He offered only the truth. He spoke of the tithes of the corrupt governors, of the starving civilians. He spoke of Huron's call for protection and of their choice not to rebel, but to defend. He acknowledged the outbreak of the Red Thirst, not as a gift from dark gods, but as the explosion of their genetic sorrow triggered by the betrayal of being attacked by their own brothers. "We chose compassion," Foros whispered, blood leaking from his lips. "If that is heresy, then condemn me." The file records a long silence. It was a chaplain of the Salamanders, a chapter, known for its own empathy, who spoke. He stated that no signs of actual chaos worship had been found on the Lamenters' vessels. No profane symbols, no dark altars, only art, poetry, and sorrow. It was a mockery of fate, the cruelest twist. The evidence of their compassion, the very thing that had damned them to this war, was now the only evidence of their innocence. They did not fight for ambition or power. They fought because they cared too much. They were not corrupted by chaos. They were simply broken by their own curse. The sentence was passed, and it was worse than death. They would not be executed. Their gene seed would be preserved, though declared suspect in the extreme. But the Lamenters chapter, as a fighting entity, was forfeit. The sentence a penitent crusade, to last 100 standard years. They were to be stripped of their fortress monastery, what was left of it. They would be forbidden to recruit. They were to turn over the bulk of their remaining war gear and ships to the Loyalist chapters. With a single barely functional strike cruiser, the battered Mater Lacrimarum, and their remaining 300 or so warriors, they were to cast themselves into the void. They were to fight in the undeclared war zones of the galaxy, without support, without resupply, without communication with the wider Imperium. They were to bear this shame for a century, fighting and dying in silence until their blood debt was paid. It was a stay of execution, a glorified exile. They were forgiven not with mercy, but with contempt. They were condemned to bleed to death in the dark, where no one could see their taint. Malachim Foros, still in chains, nodded once in acceptance. The judgment was enacted with the cold, bureaucratic cruelty that only the Imperium can perfect. The Minotaurs, their duty as butchers done, turned over the task of stripping the Lamenters to the Adeptus Mechanicus and the victorious Red Scorpions. It was a methodical, humiliating process. The file contains the logistical manifests. It reads like the dismemberment of a body. Item 7, Strike Cruisers, Honors Lament, Golden Tier, etc. Reappropriated by order of Segmentum Command. Item 47, Thunderhawk Gunships transferred to Fire Angels chapter. Item 1, 402 Suits of Mark 7, Aquila Power Armor impounded for purity analysis. They were left with nothing. The Mater Lacrimarum, their beautiful ravaged home, was returned to them, but only after being gutted. The Mechanicus Tech priests, acting on the Red Scorpion's orders, desanctified its most advanced cogitators, ripped out its primary lance batteries, and branded its drive shroud with the insignia penitentus, a massive scorched black symbol of their shame. They were forbidden from wearing their chapter icon. Their brilliant yellow armor was to remain, but the bleeding heart was forbidden. They were to be anonymous, a blank slate of shame. But in a final quiet act of defiance, Malachim Foros ordered his tech marines to paint a single black teardrop beneath the left eye lens of every helmet. They would not forget who they were. They were the mourners. With their 300 surviving warriors on a single crippled ship, they were given their first order. They were not to refuel at any Imperial station. They were not to request aid from any Imperial force. They were to proceed immediately to the Ghoul Stars. 100 years, a century of exile. The Ghoul Stars. Even in my ordo, the name is a synonym for madness and death. A region of space where the light of the Astronomicon is a guttering candle, where forgotten Xenos empires rise and fall, and where reality itself is thin. It was not a crusade. It was a death sentence to be carried out over 100 years. The dossier glosses over the specifics of this century. There are no glorious campaign records. There are no triumphant declarations. There is only a sparse, brutal list of engagements compiled from automated data slugs and garbled astropathic whispers that somehow pierced the veil. Engaged flayers of the corpse god. Result sector purged. Lamenter casualties 62%. Engaged pale wasting heresy. Result cult destroyed. Lamenter casualties 41%. Engaged orc warg gitsmarsha. Result warlord killed, fleet scattered. Lamenter casualties 78%. The numbers are an obscenity. No chapter could sustain such losses. And yet they did. Because their curse, their catastrophic ill fortune followed them into the dark. One report from a rogue trader who witnessed a battle from afar describes it perfectly. The Lamenters had set a perfect trap for an Elder Corsair fleet. An ambush in an asteroid field. The trap was sprung, and at the precise moment their torpedoes were to launch a rogue comet, undetected by any Auspex, smashed into the Mater Lacrimarum's port array, crippling its weapon systems. The battle turned from an ambush into a desperate close-quarters brawl. They won. They always won. But they won through sheer agonizing attrition. They won by drowning the enemy in their own blood. Where another chapter would have taken a dozen casualties, the Lamenters would take 100. Their victories were just as tragic as their defeats. The red thirst simmered a constant boiling rage beneath the surface. The black rage claimed more and more of them, their chaplains forced to chain the screaming, phantom-haunted warriors in the darkest holds of the ship. And yet, even in this living hell, they did not stop being Lamenters. They had no marble to carve. so they used their combat knives to scrimshaw intricate elegies onto the bones of their own fallen brothers, which were then enshrined in the ship's chapel. They had no canvas, so the few artists left among them painted tiny, heartbreaking frescoes on the inside of their own gauntlets where only they would see them. They had no instruments, so they sang. Before every hopeless battle, the Vox channel would fill with the sound of 300 mournful voices singing their laments into the void, a song of sorrow, defiance, and unbreakable duty. They were dying. They were bleeding out one warrior at a time, but they were enduring. They accepted their fate. They were paying the price for the sin of compassion. They were the Emperor's most loyal, most tragic sons. And as the 99th year of their penance drew to a close, the last entries in this section show a chapter reduced to perhaps 200 warriors, scarred, ancient, and exhausted to the very core of their souls. They were ghosts, shadows of their former glory, their yellow armor so battered it was more grey steel than gold. But they had done it. The 99th year bled into the 100th. The Mater Lacrimarum, now more a floating tomb than a warship, drifted in the cold void on the edge of the Segmentum Ultima. Its engines were silent. Its halls were quiet. The remaining 207 warriors of the Lamenters chapter were gathered in the central reliquary, their armor scarred, their faces ancient. They were not celebrating. They were waiting. The final battle of their penitent crusade. The scouring of the Slaugene cults from the Vitria moons had cost them their last apothecary and their chief tech marine. They were utterly spent. They had no way to heal their wounded. They had no way to repair their ship. They had fulfilled their oath, and their reward, they assumed, would be to die here in the cold, anonymous dark. The dossier contains a copy of the astropathic signal. It arrived on the first day of the 101st year. The signal was faint, struggling through the psychic static that surrounded the old battered cruiser. But it was pure. It bore the high-level cipher of the Adeptus Terra. For the first time in a century, the Imperium was speaking to them, not at them. The ship's few remaining astropaths, their bodies withered and frail, transcribed the message with trembling hands. Malachim Foros read it aloud to his assembled silent brothers. It was not a commendation. It was not an apology. The Imperium does not apologize. It was a single, cold, bureaucratic statement. To chapter Lamenters designate 744. Penitent Crusade, 991 M41 declared, complete. The blood debt is satisfied. Sanction of exile is lifted. By order of the High Lords of Terror, you are returned to active service. Your chapter is removed from the insignia penitentus. You may bear your arms and icons once more. Emperor protects. It was over. A century of shame. A century of bleeding in the dark. It was finished. The file records no cheering, no celebration, only a long, profound silence. The psychic imprint log of the bridge shows a single overwhelming wave of relief. It was the sound of a lung held tight for 100 years, finally exhaling. Foros, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in living memory, gave his first order as a free warrior of the Emperor. "Brothers," he said, his voice echoing in the battered hall, "fetch the pigments. It is time." With reverent hands, they brought out the last of their sacred yellow paints hoarded for this very moment. They began the slow, ritualistic process of painting over the scars. They helped each other re-inscribe the sacred weeping heart on their pauldrons. For the first time in 100 years, they were not the penitent. They were the lamenters. They were whole. They were forgiven. They were free. They could at last begin to rebuild. Find a world to recruit from. Rebuild their fleet. Restore their honor. And almost as if the universe could not stand to see them at peace, as if fate itself despised the very idea of their hope, a second signal tore through the void. This one was not cold. It was a scream. It was not a coded message from Terra. It was a psychic blast so powerful it threw the ship's astropaths into violent, blood-foaming convulsions. It was a raw, desperate cry, broadcast on all frequencies, echoing across the entire galaxy, a beacon of pure desperation. It was a call that no son of Sanguinius could ignore. It was the voice of Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. The message transcribed in the moments before the astropath's minds burned out was simple, horrifying. All sons of the angel, all brothers of the blood. And Calicon calls, "The shadow has fallen. Hive fleet Leviathan is come. Baal is besieged. We die for our home. Return to us. Return and die with honor." The two messages, one of cold absolution, the other of fiery doom, hung in the void. On the bridge of the Mater Lacrimarum, there was a new, terrible silence. The joy of their release, so fresh, was instantly poisoned by the agony of their progenitor's call. The newly painted heart on their pauldrons felt like a fresh wound. The 207 survivors of the Lamenters chapter gathered on the bridge, their scarred, ancient faces turned to their chapter master. The Mater Lacrimarum was crippled. Her warp drive was a screaming, jury-rigged ruin. Her magazines were all but empty. Her hull was a patchwork of emergency seals. They were in every practical sense a dead chapter walking. A veteran Captain Gideon, his face a web of old scars, took one heavy step forward. His voice was a low rasp, heavy with the exhaustion of 100 years of hopeless war. "Lord Foros," he said, his gaze unwavering. "We are 207. We are all that is left. The astropaths are gone. The drive will not survive another unsanctioned jump. We have no support. We have no supplies." He paused, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My lord, we are free. Terra has given us our lives back. We have earned the right to rebuild, to let the chapter survive. If we go to Baal, we go to die. We go to extinguish our flame forever. A sane commander would refuse." The truth of it hung in the air. It was logical. It was right. Their duty, their penance, was done. Malachim Foros stood, his gaze fixed on the faint, flickering light of the Astronomicon, the distant symbolic light of the Emperor. He looked at the hard light transcription of Dante's call. He looked at the face of Captain Gideon. "You are right, old friend," Foros said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the bridge. "We have earned our peace. We have the right to live. Terra itself has given it to us." He turned his battered golden armor, now bearing the proud, weeping heart catching the dim light. "But what is that right, a right to drift in this darkness, patching our hull, while our father's house burns? A right to spend another century hiding, recruiting, telling our new sons that when Baal called, when Dante called, we were busy, that we chose to live as cowards." His voice grew stronger, not with rage, but with a terrible, clarifying certainty. The certainty of a man who has seen the end of his path. "No, for 100 years we have lived under the shadow of traitor. We have borne the brand of the penitentus. We have endured. We have survived. But survival," he slammed his gauntleted fist against the tactical display, "is not honor." He faced his men. 200 warriors, the last of his kind. "Dante does not call us to victory," he roared, the poet's sorrow replaced by the warrior's soul. "He calls us to die. He offers us the one thing no high lord, no inquisitor, no victorious battle ever could. He offers us an end to our lament. He offers us a good death. A son's death." He pointed to the helm. "We have lived in shame for far too long. Now we will die in glory. We will die as we were born, true sons of Sanguinius." He raised his power glaive, its golden blade still scarred from 1,000 battles. "Helm, plot a course for the Baal system. Use the last of our fuel. Use the last of our strength." We answer the call. And for the first time in a century, the 200 voices of the Lamenters shouted not in grief, not in rage, but in pure, unified purpose. A single triumphant shout that defied their curse. For Sanguinius, for the Emperor. The crippled Mater Lacrimarum, with an exhausted crew and a dying drive, turned its prow toward the greatest Tyrannid invasion in galactic history. It turned toward home. My file on the Badab War is a fortress of vellum and ink. My file on Hive Fleet Leviathan is an abyss. It is the record of a monster that defies comprehension, a creature whose scale is not measured in ships or soldiers, but in the planetary masses it consumes. It is into this abyss that the Lamenters now plunged. When the Mater Lacrimarum tore its way back into real space, it did not arrive in the Baal system. It arrived in Hell. The transition was not the clean, sharp lurch of a successful warp jump. It was the shuddering, tearing breach of a swimmer surfacing into a hurricane. The bridge of the old cruiser screamed with alarms as the crippled Geller field collapsed. But the alarms were secondary. The true horror was the silence. The ever-present guiding beacon of the Astronomicon, the Emperor's own light, which is the birthright and comfort of every soul in the Imperium, was gone. It was not just blocked, it was devoured. This is the true horror of the hive mind. We in our ignorance call it the shadow in the warp. This is an insufficient name. It is not a shadow. A shadow is a lack of light. This was a presence. It was a psychic wall of pure, monolithic, singular hunger. It was the suffocating, mind-crushing weight of a trillion voices, all screaming one word: feed. It was an anti-spirituality. A void that did not just negate faith, but actively physically crushed it. On the bridge, mortals collapsed, bleeding from their eyes, their minds shattered. Even the superhuman Lamenters, the sons of Sanguinius, buckled. They clutched their heads, their superhuman willpower, the only thing keeping their minds from dissolving. They were swimming in the digestive juices of a god-beast. "Auspex is blind, my lord?" A sergeant stammered, his voice thick, fighting the psychic pressure. "All channels? Nothing. The system, it's dead." "It is not dead," Malakim Foros rasped, his hand gripping the arm of his command throne, his knuckles white. He forced himself to stand a lone golden tower against the crushing psychic night. "It is here. All of it. Steer us. Steer us toward the source of the scream." Through this psychic sludge, the crippled cruiser pushed on its engines, whining in protest. For hours they saw nothing but the swirling, fleshy mass of the Hive fleet's outer tendrils. And then they cleared the interference. They saw it. Not a fleet, an ocean. The void of the Baal system was choked. It was a living, writhing, chitinous sea of bioships, vessels the size of moons ribbed with armor, and trailing tentacles that stretched for thousands of kilometers drifted in the black. Swarms of smaller creatures numbering in the uncounted billions moved between them, a living tide of flesh and carapace that blotted out the stars. The Star of Baal itself was a dull red smear behind this living curtain. And this ocean was crashing against a handful of tiny glittering islands of light, the last-ditch defenses of the Blood Angels. The dossier here contains Dante's final dispositions. It is the strategy of a man with too few soldiers and too many gates to defend. The strategy of a king who knows his castle is already lost and seeks only to buy time for a miracle he does not believe in. He had scattered his children. The gathered chapters of the blood, the flesh tearers, the blood drinkers, the angels, Sanguine, the knights of the chalice, all the sons of Sanguinius who had answered the call were being thrown into the meat grinder. The main defensive line was at Baal itself, and its two moons, Baal Primus and Baal Secundus. The orbital platforms were swarmed, burning. The flesh-tearers in their red-hot fury were holding the line on Primus. The angels Sanguine held the fortress monastery. Every chapter, every warrior had been given a wall to die upon. The system was too large. The enemy was too numerous. Dante was sacrificing his sun's sector by sector, moon by moon, planet by planet, to buy his home world. Ours. The Mater Lacrimarum, a single scarred yellow ship, coasted into this apocalypse, its distress beacon flashing a single ancient defiant code, Chapter Lamenters, answering the call. The signal from the Mater Lacrimarum cut through the vox chatter of the besieged system like a ghost's whisper. On the command bridge of the Blade of Vengeance, Lord Commander Dante, his ancient face a mask of inhuman weariness, looked at the tactical rune that had just flared to life. Lamenters, my archive contains the strained vox log of their exchange. It is a masterpiece of tragic brevity. Lord Foros, Dante's voice dry as the dust of Baal crackled across the void. The background of his transmission was a wall of sound screams, bolt fire, the roar of collapsing fortresses. You came, by the blood. You came. Lord Commander Malachim Foros's reply was steady, the voice of a warrior who had made his peace. Chapter Lamenters. 207 strong. We await your command. A pause. The file notes a 4.7-second delay. Dante was processing the impossible. The cursed, the exiled, the survivors of a century of penance. The one chapter in the galaxy who had every right to turn their backs had come. They had brought their 200 remaining souls and their one crippled ship into the mouth of the apocalypse. 207. Dante's voice was heavy with the weight of the butcher's bill he was about to sign. He was a general who had just been handed a single priceless, fragile new blade, and his only option was to hurl it into the heart of the furnace. His gaze shifted on the tactical display. The main swarm of Leviathan was crashing against Baal, but the display was flashing a new urgent threat. A tendril Lord Foros, hive tendril, Scylla. It has splintered from the main fleet. Dante's voice became cold, precise, the voice of command. It is bypassing our primary defenses. It's on an intercept course for the Courier system. Foros did not need to consult a chart. He knew. Courier, a populated forge moon home to the system's secondary astropathic relay, and more importantly, the last of the Blood Angels' reserve fuel and ammunition stockpiles. It was the back door. I cannot spare a single warrior from this fight. Malachim Dante continued the false formality of their titles, a thin veil over the horror of his request. The line on Baal Secundus is breaking. The flesh-tearers are engaged. I have nothing left. Foros looked at his own tactical display. The red rune of hive tendril Scylla was not a squad. It was a fleet. Thousands of bioships, and his own single blue icon. You are not asking us to intercept, Lord Commander Foros stated. It was not a question. No, Dante replied. The single word was a death sentence. Interception is impossible. You are to land on Courier. You are to secure the planetary defense network and the primary forge spire. You must hold that moon. For how long? Foros asked, his voice betraying no fear. This time, the pause was longer. The background noise on Dante's end fell away for a moment, as if he had sealed his private chamber to deliver this final, terrible sentence. Until you are relieved, or you are annihilated. That tendril cannot be allowed to feed. It cannot be allowed to flank us. You must buy us time. It was a suicide order. There would be no relief. Both of them knew it. The 207 last Lamenters were being ordered to stand in the path of a tidal wave, and hold it if only for a few precious hours. They were to be the sacrifice that bought Baal its slim chance of survival. This was their redemption. Not a pardon from terror, not a glorious victory, but an order to die for their brothers, for their home. Malachim Foros looked at his assembled warriors on the bridge. Their ancient, scarred faces, now free of their penitent's teardrop, were grim but resolute. They had heard. They understood. He turned back to the Vox. It is a good death, Lord Dante Foros, said his voice now imbued with a strange, profound calm. We will not lament this. We will hold Courier. We will not fail you. The log records a sharp, pained intake of breath from Dante's end. Malachim, brother, may the angel guide your... He couldn't finish it. Foros cut the channel. There was nothing more to say. He turned to his shipmaster. The finality of their purpose, the tragic perfection of their end had settled on him like a shroud of glory. Helm, he commanded, his voice ringing with the first true note of peace he had felt in a century. Take us to Courier, all speed. We have one last duty to perform. Courier was a world of grey metal and red dust. A typical joyless forge moon, its air thick with the taste of ozone and promethium. Now its sky was a churning purple-black nightmare of descending spores. The Mater Lacrimarum, too crippled to fight in orbit, performed its final act, a suicidal burning-hot atmospheric insertion crash, landing itself like a fortress spear into the heart of the primary forge spire Adamantus. The 207 Lamenters, clad in their newly painted yellow armor, disembarked into chaos. The local planetary defense force, the Corian Adamantites, were in a full-blown panic. Their vox nets were screaming. Their lines had broken before the battle had even begun. Malakim Forus's first act was not to shout orders, but to sing. His augmented voice, carrying the first stanza of the Lament of Sanguinius, cut through the static and the fear. It was a song of sorrow, but also of profound duty. The effect was immediate. The fleeing PDF troopers stopped. They turned. They saw the golden giants standing calm in the face of annihilation. The Lamenters did not deploy as conquerors. They deployed as protectors. They moved with a desperate, tragic efficiency. "Line is here," Foros roared, plunging his glaive into the Ferrocrete Plaza before the spire's main gate. "We are the wall for Baal for the angel." The battle preparations were a microcosm of their entire existence. The few remaining tech marines, their robes tattered, moved among the PDF's autocannons, not cursing their primitive machine spirits, but gently coaxing them, blessing them for one last volley. "Let every shot be a eulogy," their leader whispered, his hand resting on a trembling gunner's shoulder. Their single surviving apothecary brother Enos moved among the PDF ranks, his Narthesium in hand. But he was not harvesting gene seed. He was administering the Emperor's peace to the mortally wounded PDF troopers, the ones already hit by the first waves of mycetic spores. He knelt beside a young guardsman whose legs were gone, and his voice was soft, blocking out the man's screams. "The angel sees you, son of terror. Be at peace." It was the same compassion that had damned them now playing out as their final act. They had 200 Astartes. They had perhaps 5,000 terrified guardsmen. Against them the sky was falling. The first wave was not a wave. It was an ocean. The horizon ceased to be a horizon. It became a moving mass of chitin and teeth. Hormagaunts and termagants, a sea of creatures, billions upon billions, swarmed forward, their collective shriek, a physical weight against the defenders. Fire Foros bellowed. The golden wall erupted. 200 bolters firing in perfect, disciplined volleys tore gaping holes in the swarm. The PDF's autocannons and lasguns added their desperate, weaker song. The Lamenters fought with the sublime, tragic skill of their bloodline. They were demigods, their movements a blur of gold. They were artists of death, their chainswords singing as they parried, lunged, and dismembered. For every Lamenter, 100 Xenos died. But for every 100 that died, 1,000 more took their place. It was a battle of pure mathematics, of attrition. The line held. It held for 1 hour. It held for 2. The plaza was knee-deep in Xenos gore and brass casings. The Lamenters stood like statues in a red sea, their yellow armor drenched in ichor. And the losses began. Brother Chiron, the same warrior who centuries ago had knelt to comfort a dying child, was the first. A carnifex, an avalanche of armored spite, smashed through the PDF line, and Chiron met it. He did not charge in rage. He met it as a protector. He jammed his power sword into its eye lens, but the beast's death throes brought its scything talons down, cutting him in half. His death was a crack in the dam. Another fell, dragged down by a tide of ripper swarms. Another, his bolter running dry, was simply buried alive under a mound of leaping hormagaunts. And as the number of the living dipped below 150, the final terrible curse of Sanguinius, held at bay for 10,000 years, awoke. It was Captain Gideon, his arm torn from its socket, who succumbed first. His eyes, visible through his cracked helmet lens, went blank, then filled with a burning, terrible light. A scream not of pain, but of transcendent, ancient agony tore from his vox. Horus, he shrieked, his voice distorting. Traitor at the gates, for the Emperor and Sanguinius, death, death. It was the black rage. It spread like fire. One by one, the beleaguered dying warriors of the Lamenters fell. Their minds snapped. They were no longer on Coria. They were on Terra at the Eternity Gate, fighting beside their angelic father at the dawn of this cursed age. The last vestiges of their sorrowful artistic souls were burned away, replaced by the pure, unadulterated, glorious rage of their Primarch. Their discipline shattered. Their song ended. They charged. No longer a wall, they became a chaotic, golden spearhead of pure, screaming madness. They threw themselves into the heart of the swarm, their chainswords revving into a single, deafening howl. They were no longer poets. They were gods of war dying in the battle for which they were truly born. This was the final, cruelest joke of their cursed founding. They were spared the rage their entire existence only to be consumed by it in their final moments, their noble sacrifice of compassion forgotten, replaced by a final mindless, bloody slaughter. Malachim Foros watched it happen, his heart breaking. He alone, by some miracle of willpower or depth of grief, remained lucid. He saw his brothers, his poets, his artists reduced to howling beasts dying in a battle that had already been lost. Then the ground shook. Through the endless sea of gaunts, a new shape emerged. A Hierophant Bio-Titan. A walking mountain of flesh and claws, its bio-cannons already glowing, zeroing in on the forge spire's gate. The charge of the black rage broke against its feet like water against a cliff. The creature barely noticed them crushing raging Astartes under its tread. The line was gone. The rage was spent. The wall was shattered. "Fall back!" Foros screamed into the Vox, his voice thick with despair. To the spire, all survivors back to the final gate. He turned, dragging a wounded PDF trooper with him, as the shadow of the Bio-Titan fell over them all. The adamantium gates of the forge spire Adamantus buckled. The Hierophant, a living siege engine, hammered against it, its bio-cannons melting the plasteel and stone. The plaza was gone, a carpet of chittering feeding bodies. Malachim Foros knelt behind the last barricade of broken-down transports. His side was pierced by a talon, his golden armor ripped open. His left power glaive was shattered. Around him, the last of his chapter. Not 200, not 100. 12. 12 warriors out of ammunition, their chainswords broken or silent. They stood in a semicircle, back to back, with their dying lord, their combat knives clutched in their gauntlets. They were the ones the Black Rage had not claimed. The ones whose sorrow was too deep, whose duty was too strong. They were the last true Lamenters. The endless tide of Tyranids paused, pulling back as if making way. The Hierophant ceased its bombardment. Into the sudden, terrifying silence, a new sound came. A heavy, measured, slithering tread. Foros forced himself to his feet, using his remaining glaive as a crutch. He looked at his last 12 sons, their faces streaked with blood, and ichor their eyes clear and full of an agonizing, beautiful sorrow. They were not afraid. They were just finished. He activated his Helm Vox, broadcasting on an open channel, a signal so weak it would barely reach Dante, a signal for the archives. Not a tactical report. A testament. They say, "The great angel saw the end," Foros whispered, his voice a dry rasp, the poet's soul speaking its final lines. He saw the betrayal. He saw the darkness. He knew he would fall at the foot of the arch-traitor. The 12 warriors raised their knives, a final silent salute. But he fought on. Foros continued, his voice gaining a fraction of its old strength. He fought, not for a victory he knew he could not win. He fought for a future he would never see. A new creature stepped into the plaza. It was not a mindless beast. It was a leader. A Trigon Prime, its 4 massive scythe talons, dripping with gore, its eyes burning with the cold, alien intelligence of the hive mind. It had come to personally extinguish this last stubborn light. "We are his sons," Foros breathed, "cursed not with his rage, but with his sorrow. We share his final, hopeless duty." The Trigon roared a sound that shattered the last of the spire's windows. It charged. The 12 Lamenters with their broken knives did not hesitate. They threw themselves at the mountain of flesh and chitin, a final hopeless act of defiance. They were swatted from the air, impaled, torn asunder in a heartbeat. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Malachim Foros was alone. He faced the Trigon. He raised his broken glaive. He did not roar. He did not curse. He simply closed his eyes, his duty finally mercifully complete. "Mother of tears," he whispered, "receive us." The scythes fell. On the bridge of the Blade of Vengeance orbiting the besieged world of Baal, an adept glanced at a tactical console. "My lord Dante," the adept's voice was flat hollow. "A loss to report. The Auspex rune for chapter Lamenters at Coria." Dante looked. The single golden icon which had been burning with desperate, furious battle data flickered. A new line of text appeared beside it, biometry critical. It flickered again. "Vital 0. The golden icon, the weeping heart, turned black, and then it vanished. Signal lost. The Vox channel, which for a moment had carried the faint, whispered sound of poetry, dissolved into pure, empty static. On the forge moon of Coria there was no more battle. There was no more song. There was only silence and the sound of feeding. The file is closed. The final Vox log, that whisper of poetry dissolving into static, still hangs in the air of my archive. Here in the cold, sanctified silence of the Ordo Hereticus, the story should end. The case is closed. Extinctus in servitium. But the truth of the Imperium is never so simple. I cross-referenced the Coria file with the records of the Baal campaign. The reports from Coria stopped. The moon fell silent, was consumed, and became another dead rock in a system of graves. On Baal itself, the true battle, the Armageddon of the Blood Angels, reached its zenith. Commander Dante, Lord of the Host, was dying. The Swarm Lord, the ultimate expression of the hive mind's will, had broken his guard and was poised for the final killing blow. The fortress monastery of the Blood Angels was breached. The final redoubt was about to fall. The sons of Sanguinius were making their last hopeless stand, just as their brothers on Coria had done. The system was lost, and then the heavens tore open, not the fleshy biological nightmare of the Tyranid fleet. No, a different, cleaner, more terrible light. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, ripped the galaxy in half, and from its unreal energies a new fleet emerged. A fleet of blue, a fleet of impossible reinforcement. Robert Guilliman, the avenging son, the resurrected Primarch, had returned. With him came the fury of the Indomitus Crusade. With him came the Primaris Marines, new shining perfect warriors, untainted by the millennia of decay and loss. The battle for Baal turned. It was no longer a last stand, it was a crusade. The Primarch himself, a demigod of vengeance, tore the Swarm Lord apart. The new forged Marines cleansed the Tyranid infestation with cold, precise fire. The hive fleet, its synapse creatures shattered, broke and scattered. Baal was saved. It was a miracle. A new dawn for the Imperium. Glory, victory, rebirth. These are the words used in the official histories. Dante was saved, pulled from the brink of death. The Blood Angels were reinforced, their losses replaced, their gene seed stabilized. A great victory was celebrated, and in the celebrations, who remembered Coria? Who remembered the 207 warriors who had bought them their miracle? I have searched the debriefs, I have scoured the logistical reports, and I found it. A single note from a Mechanicus analyst assessing the failure points of the hive mind's assault. It states with cold precision that Hive Tendril Scylla, a force of overwhelming strength, was delayed from its objective, the flanking of Baal's primary command and control, by 4.3 standard hours. The analyst attributes this delay to unexpectedly stubborn resistance from local PDF elements on the Forge Moon of Coria. Local PDF elements. 4 hours. That was the price of a chapter. 4 hours of time for Dante to consolidate his final defense. 4 hours for Guilliman's fleet to make its final calculations for the warp jump. 4 hours bought with the blood of the last 200 Lamenters. Their sacrifice mattered. It was the final tragic fulcrum upon which the fate of Baal and all the sons of Sanguinius had turned. And what is their monument? What hymn is sung for them in the great fortress of the Blood Angels? Nothing. They are forgotten. They are a rounding error in a war of gods. Their final bureaucratic epitaph is the one I read in the dossier chapter Lamenters. Status extinctus in servitium, extinct in service. A neat, tidy line to close the book on 10,000 years of suffering. 10,000 years of loyalty that was never, ever repaid. 10,000 years of being punished for the cardinal sin of empathy. Solved. The file lies on my desk. But my order is not so easily satisfied. We are hunters of the unquiet dead, of the loose threads. And there is one. One last horrifying rumor that defies this neat conclusion. A whisper logged by a deep void listening post in the Segmentum Pacificus near the festering edge of the new rift. The log speaks of a ghost ship, the Mater Lacrimarum, the Mother of Tears. The records are contradictory. Some accounts state Phoros transferred his command to a faster ship for the suicidal run to Coria, ordering his flagship carrying the last of their gene seed, their art, their history, to flee into the void to preserve the chapter's soul. Others say the ancient crippled cruiser simply missed the jump torn from its master by the roiling chaos of the warp, arriving too late for the battle and too late to be saved. The rumor is this: the Mater Lacrimarum did not die. It drifts. It is a dead hulk trapped in the inescapable gravity well of a collapsing star. Its engines are cold. Its lights are dark. It does not answer hails, but it is not silent. The listening post recorded one signal, a single repeating automated broadcast, looped for eternity, or until the ship's last power fails. It is not a plea for help. It is not a warning. It is a scream. A single unending multiplexed howl composed of perhaps 2, perhaps 3 dozen distinct voices. It is the sound of the Black Rage, the final, cruelest joke of the universe. The last survivors of the Lamenters, the few dozen brothers who were not at Coria, they were not granted a glorious death. They were not granted a peaceful end. They are trapped, adrift in a dead ship in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, with no hope of rescue, no way to die, and no mind left to understand why. They are just raging. The last sons of Sanguinius trapped forever in their father's final agony, a Greek chorus of madness, weeping for a tragedy that no one is left to hear. This then is their true fate. Not a noble sacrifice, not a warrior's end, just a slow, insane, unwitnessed descent into oblivion. A final lament signifying nothing. I turn my gaze from the data slate. My duty is to the truth, and the truth of this galaxy is grim. The tragedy of the Lamenters is not that they fell to chaos. The tragedy is that they didn't. They fell to us. They fell to our uncaring bureaucracy, our paranoid suspicion, and our cold, calculated demand for sacrifice. They were damned by their own virtue. My hand rests on the cold, shattered pauldron, the artifact that began my search. The yellow paint. The bleeding heart. A symbol of compassion. In the Imperium of man, this is the most dangerous heresy of all. I place the shard back in its stasis field. I close the file, but the image remains burned into my memory, the true and final epitaph of the cursed. A piece of shattered yellow armor, a small bleeding heart, buried, forgotten, and unmourned under 1 billion tons of digested alien biomass on a dead and silent world forever named Coria.